Today we've got some nuclear revenge and someone getting expelled. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, I punked my class prankster. I've never been one to start trouble. In fact, I like to see myself as a pacifist because I'll always choose the most peaceful option unless I'm really pushed to the edge, and my rather high tolerance for BS means I take a lot of stuff most people would never allow. My father had 3 boys, and though he tried to train all 3 of us to be gentle, I was the only one who never got into a fight or altercation at school. But all that would soon change as I got into high school. High school for me was vastly different to elementary school. I attended a Catholic elementary school where they taught, possibly enforced, restraint, and doing all things that pleased the Lord, so being on the docile side actually played to my advantage, especially as I combined it with good results. We had very few actual troublemakers, so getting into trouble came with an extreme amount of judgment. High school was a different ballgame entirely. From day one, it seemed like half the boys were unruly. It was a bit understandable though, because if you put dozens of adolescent boys together anywhere, you'd get nothing but an agglomeration of raging hormones. There were girls and they were mostly cool, but they were also the reason some boys had to prove themselves as the most hormone-filled rascal to ever walk the earth. Some boys channeled their energy into sports, some went into vocational subjects to impress the girls with their wood and electrical work, while some just tried to garner the most attention by any means possible. From doing unfathomable and dangerous tricks, to taking digs at students and teachers, to pulling off some of the craziest pranks I'd ever seen. Growing up, I used to watch a lot of prank shows on TV, so I especially liked pranksters. I didn't condone it, but I would always appreciate a good prank. There were a lot of pranksters in my school, so much so that we couldn't go more than 3 days without hearing of a new prank tale. On numerous occasions, the principal had to publicly condemn the acts during assemblies. Most times they went unpunished unless it was done to a teacher, and even then, they still had to fish out the culprits, and it was usually difficult to get anyone to snitch, because pranks had become more or less student tradition and snitching was against the code. This didn't mean snitching was rare by any means, as there were a number of students we called tattletales, who were always ready to report to the authorities whenever something illegal happened. So the trick was usually to be discreet enough in planning pranks that the tattletales wouldn't be able to know who had done it. There were a few classes without them though, and surprisingly, those were the classes with the highest number of pranksters. I was in one of such classes, and the things with those kinds of classes was that people would straight up try to out-prank each other. In fact, in my class, the competition for best prankster was much more fierce than the competition for best student. And even though I was in the latter, I was always acknowledging the former. I was one of the more quiet people in class, and with the kind of class I was in, it was always going to be polarizing. Some people liked the fact that I was different from basically all the boys in the class, and actually tried to compete with the girls to be the top student, while others called me a spoil sport who didn't like having hormone-stimulating fun, especially as I always seemed to comment on their pranks and tricks. Personally, I just love to observe, which is how I was able to tell which of my classmates put the most time into pulling off their pranks. There were 2 to pick from, but one stood out from the other just because of the caliber of pranks he pulled off. He spared absolutely no one. From boys to girls to janitors and even teachers, he pranked everyone he possibly could. One time he stole some ammonia from the science lab and sprinkled it around our classroom, and the smell was so bad that we weren't able to have classes for the rest of the day and had to share a classroom with another class. Another time he brought some egg whites from home and poured it into the janitor's cleaning bucket just before the floor corridor was mopped, and this made the entire place smell like eggs. He wasn't caught though, as he did this before most students had arrived at school that morning. He only later told some of his close friends after the whole episode had died down. Arguably his biggest prank ever was when he unleashed dozens of soldier ants on one of our teachers after hatching one of the greatest plans you could ever see from a high schooler. That day he brought a small jar filled with soldier ants, and while we knew he was up to mischief, we had no idea how or whom he was going to use it. But we all kept our guard because it could have easily have been anyone due to how unhinged he was. It was during biology class, and the entire class usually took those lessons together in the science lab, so it was a prime location for this particular prank. We were going to study some soil specimen, which was a very hands-on topic, and there were jars filled with all the soils we were going to examine. Being a keen observer, I watched him transfer some of his soldier ants into the humus-filled loam jar. The soil study began, and those who had saw what happened watched anxiously as our teacher dipped his full hand into the loam jar to extract some soil, only for him to be attacked by a swath of soldier ants that quickly got into his shirt. He sustained multiple bites as he struggled to get rid of them and ended up having to be admitted into the sick bay. The prankster wasn't caught for this, probably because the tattletales in the combined class didn't see him commit the crime, but it was a very close call, and he would later be suspended for trying to pull off a similar prank. Now, I wasn't friends with the prankster due to his notoriety, but we had mutual respect for each other as we shared a few common interests. But all that respect soon turned to disdain as he would finally attempt one of his pranks on me. This isn't to say I'd never been pranked before. Being in a class such as mine, it was almost impossible to escape being pranked for more than a week, but most of the time, they were usually minor pranks which I would just laugh over. I didn't like to get into altercations, so I never made a fuss of the pranks like some other people would, and this probably led to the class prankster thinking I had no boundaries because he would be extreme for his first prank on me. It was a Thursday afternoon just after lunch break. I had spent my break time outside playing football under the hot midday sunshine with some of the boys from school, so I obviously got thirsty and needed a drink. On getting to class, I met most of my classmates seated, so I began to look around to see if anyone had a drink, and there he was with a bottle of an apple-flavored Spanish soda called La Casera, and when he saw the exhaustion on my face, he immediately asked if I wanted to take a gulp of his drink while wearing a suspiciously wry smile. I didn't suspect any foul play at this point, firstly because I was really thirsty, and he was the only one to offer me a drink, and secondly because he'd never pulled a prank on me before, so I accepted his drink. A few of the girls in the class were screaming "don't" and "no" as I raised the bottle to drink, but I ignored it because of how thirsty I was and poured the first mouthful in, and you can imagine how shocked I was when the apple-flavored soda turned out to be pee. I quickly spat it back out, but the entire class had already gone hysterical at this point. I was so embarrassed, mostly because I had no idea whose pee I just put in my mouth, but also because I'd let my guard down to his prankster tendencies just because I was thirsty. I wanted to punch him so bad, but my self-esteem wouldn't let me, so I just let him know that I was going to get back at him. I had never pranked anyone in class before, but that wasn't because I didn't know my onions, but rather because I didn't want to get into any possible altercations. I wasn't the most physical kid, you see, but now there was actual motive to get my prankster face on. I began to rewatch some episodes of those prank shows I used to love, and also went on the internet so I could devise a proper plan to get my revenge. I'll tell you this, vengeance is one of the best fuels for motivation, and this was the case here because I ended up with an entire list of pranks I could pull off when I had the chance. I didn't want to be a repeated offender, so I had to pick just one that I could pull off regardless of the circumstances in class. It wasn't easy picking the best one though, so it took me days to come to a decision, and I eventually decided to let it be spontaneous, as long as I can hit him where it hurt, and this was exactly how it went. It was a big day at school. We had an external junior debate competition with another school, and every member of our class was to go and support the debate team at the venue of the competition. I hadn't mentioned it earlier, but our class prankster was actually a member of the debate team, so he was slated to be one of the students representing the school. Everyone was looking their best, especially the boys, because we'd heard about the girls from the other school and wanted to impress them with our swag. The day prior was when I hatched my plan for revenge. Our vice principal had instructed the various class teachers to get 3 students each from their classes for the bi-monthly labor exercise, where the entire school got cleaned up for about an hour. These 3 students were usually picked from the worst behaved over the period of 2 academic months as a form of punishment, even though it counted towards extracurricular grades. I got to know this from my class captain, who was a friend and also a witness to the pee prank pulled on me some weeks prior. She was also placed in charge of picking the classmates to be called up for labor duty by our class teacher and was to submit it the day before the big debate. And so my plan was set. She had showed me her list before she submitted it, so I made a parallel list and replaced the last name with the name of my prankster and silently followed her to our class teacher's desk, then replaced her list with mine after she left. I tried to mimic her handwriting as much as possible and hoped our teacher wouldn't notice. Back to the big day, we were all getting ready when our class teacher came in to call the names of the students selected for labor duty. The first 2 names were called as listed, and I held my breath for the final name to see if my plan had worked. So when the name of our class prankster was called, I breathed a sigh of relief that she hadn't recognized the change in handwriting. He tried to explain to our class teacher that he was part of the debate team, but she wasn't having any of it. It was time for our favorite prankster to report for labor duty, and it was a race against time for him to meet up with the bus before it left for the debate competition, but I still had one more prank in me. As he left to trim the hedges and do the other stuff they usually did during labor duty, he forgot his school bag in class. I quickly noticed and took his bag when no one else was paying attention, so I could give him a little search mission when he returned from duty. I checked the contents of the bag to see that there were important documents for the debate in there, which made it even sweeter. I decided to hide the bag somewhere he wouldn't possibly look: the school library. After an hour of painstaking labor duty, he finally came back into the class, drenched in sweat and visibly distraught, but he seemed ready to distract himself with the debate that was coming up. The school buses were getting warmed up at this point, so it was announced that everyone interested could begin to board the bus, as it was to leave in 5 minutes. He began to make a move towards the bus when he realized his school bag was no longer where he had dropped it. So he began to search frantically, and I decided to stay back to give him a helping hand, but we were still searching when the school buses began to leave. He was more distraught than ever and even tried to chase down the bus, only to be stopped at the school gate for not having the required documents. He had a mini breakdown, and when he finally recovered, I simply told him to go and look in the library for his bag. At this point, he began to suspect me, but I didn't care, as the school buses had long left. He went into the library and came out with his school bag and chased after me for a good 2 minutes. After catching up to me, I simply reminded him of my promise to get back at him, and he just said, "Well played." Just like the MTV show I used to love watching, my class prankster had just officially been punked. He was eventually replaced on the debate team and lost his spot as one of the main debaters in the school team after missing the competition. I might have drunk pee, but this time I was glad I didn't choose to make peace. Honestly, I think a lot of people would have done a lot worse in revenge than what OP ended up doing to this guy. Do you think what OP did was justified considering the way they treated OP? I'd like to know what you guys think. That said, our next story is, he took my sister and I got him expelled. A single decision can alter the course of a lifetime, and in my case, it was a not-so-simple choice between love, family, and the fight for redemption. We grew up in a small suburban neighborhood, or quite correctly, I used to live with my dad here until I was 4. It wasn't until my father and Sarah met that I had a sibling, Natalie. Let me give you an insight into what we were like. Natalie was a year my senior. She was 5 when we first met, and for some reason, we happened to find an instant connection. Growing up with my dad and Sarah as our parents, my bond with Natalie was ununderstandable. We were literally more than sisters. We were confidants, partners in crime, and best friends. We flourished in unison from the early days of building sandcastles at the beach to late nights huddled under the covers, whispering secrets we had never told any other person. To the world, she was my sister, not my stepsister, and Sarah was my mother. My dad says I called her mom the first day he brought her over to the house, and that was how he knew she was the one to mend the broken heart my birth mother had left him with when she ran off with her high school sweetheart to chase a dream my dad apparently could not provide her. Well, that's his story, not mine, and I have no memory of ever calling her mom. I like to think that Natalie and I were born to be sisters. We were soulmates, sisters with an unbreakable bond, and our parents were aware of this. Maybe it was the result of the loneliness I felt before she came to live with us. Maybe we genuinely fit together. I still can't place it correctly, but our childhood was filled with laughter and shared adventures. We would spend hours exploring the woods behind our house, crafting imaginary worlds only both of us could understand, and chasing fireflies well into when we lost light from the sun. We were a dynamic duo. She was as much a support that I was to her, to me, through triumphs and setbacks. And the more we grew into adulthood, the more we found it hard to do without each other. As a teenager, I could tell that Natalie was the one with the infectious laugh and indomitable spirit. She was like a beacon that guided me through the outburst of teenagehood, and it helped that she was a year older than me. We shared dreams, fears, and aspirations, weaving a tapestry of trust that seemed unassailable. She was mine, and I was hers forever. This is why when I saw a thing that appeared to threaten the eternity of our bond, I sought to take it from the picture, even if it had to be at the cost of her happiness she thought she felt. Because I've been her happiness. She was just confused. He was the reason we had a falling out. I'm not crazy, that's for sure, but he had to go. It was simply logical that Matthew had to get out of our lives. And the irony is that I was the one that let him into our space in the first instance. I remember the day like it was yesterday when Matthew appeared before our eyes. It was easy for him to wind himself into our lives. He was 19 and a senior. Sarah and my dad finally made enough to move us out of our crappy town and apartment. I loved that house, but it just wasn't meant for a family more than two. It was fine when it was just me and my dad, but we struggled to fit in when we became 4. I expected that move a while before it actually happened. We were in a new environment and Matthew's family lived right next to ours. He dropped by in the company of his mother, the strong-willed blonde, to give us what would seem like a welcome to the neighborhood vanilla pudding pie. I got to the door after hearing the doorbell chime, and Natalie was on my tail almost immediately, and from the moment he walked through the porch onto our front door, he became an irrevocable part of our lives. Well, for a while, I saw Natalie's eyes sparkle with a newfound radiance when she sighted him by the door. This radiance continued whenever Matthew was within 5 feet or seeable vision. His presence seemed to ignite a flame within her, awakening a sense of joy and adventure that I'd never witnessed before. It was as if he held the key to unlock the depths of her heart, drawing her closer with each passing second they held each other's gaze. I didn't understand it. It got me pissed. Over the days, they seemed to find a quick footing almost instantly, but wasn't that like our thing? She claimed he made her feel alive, like she was finally being seen by someone. To be fair, he had this charisma to him. Perhaps it came from being a senior. I couldn't quite place it. And besides the fact that he was drop-dead gorgeous, he had good wit and a curiosity for others from a distance. But it wasn't just for Natalie. He pulled his move on the whole of my family. Without having to do so much, he found a way to integrate himself into our daily routines. I would see him late at night joining us for family dinners, game nights, and even those impromptu adventures Natalie and I used to love taking. For a while, his presence made me feel like a complete stranger in my own home, as I was constantly lurking in the shadows. Despite my initial reservations and strides of envy at how he was an accepted part of us, I couldn't help but be drawn to Matthew's energy. His presence brought a fresh perspective to our lives, challenging us to step outside our comfort zones and embrace the unknown. He had a way of making the ordinary extraordinary, infusing mundane moments with a touch of magic. I fought it, but I found myself losing the battle one too many times and I gave up. We were no longer a duo, myself and Natalie. We became a trio, and I wondered if Matt, as we grew to fondly refer to him, had any close friends before we moved into town. He brought a new dynamic within our sisterhood. While it was natural for Natalie's attention to be divided between us, I tried to find solace in the fact that his presence seemed to amplify the love between us rather than diminish it. He became a pillar of support for both of us, offering his 2 years of wisdom to provide guidance and encouragement when we needed it. Our union was something unique, I guess. He was the much-needed spice to our adventure. From road trips to hidden waterfalls to spontaneous camping trips under a star-studded sky, he showed us the beauty of embracing life's unpredictable moments. Maybe his inclination for the unpredictable should have been the hint I needed that Matthew wasn't all he seemed to be, but I was oblivious to that. My focus was on something that mattered more to me, Natalie. I tried to fight it. I really did try to fight off that underlying feeling that there was something off with Matthew. It wasn't in the way he acted around us. It was just a knowing I had. Or maybe it was the jealousy from seeing how it was too effortless to bring a smile to Natalie's face, how he seemed to understand her in a way that I couldn't. It was an internal battle, wrestling with my insecurities and the fear of being left behind. It was that serious, knowing that she would find no use for me in the coming weeks. I had no reason to believe what I believed, to be honest. At least, not until that day by the pool of Matt's house. We were on break again, and this time, the sun was on a quest to beat down, so we sought refuge in the cool embrace of the pool over at Matthew's house. We sat there enjoying the feeling of not being bothered by schoolwork or the pressures of our teachers. We could finally unwind and enjoy the bliss of life. That was what we went for. Little did I know that this seemingly idyllic day would forever alter the course of our relationship. As the heat intensified, I volunteered to fetch refreshing drinks for our trio. Excusing myself with a smile, I left them by the pool, completely unaware of the fact that I would be the center of the conversation that would unravel in my absence. The sound of splashing water echoed in my ears as I made my way back to the poolside from the kitchen. It was then with a drink in hand that I overheard Matthew's voice, tinged with a mixture of affection and frustration. "I feel like she's become a bit of a leech on all of our outings," he confessed, his words seeping into the depths of my being. "I put up with her only because of you, Natty. It's always been you." Natty. He called her by the nickname only I was allowed to call her. But of course, that wasn't enough undoing to my resolve. As long as I had Natalie, my world was fine. But as it would turn out, I didn't. I felt my heart shatter as I heard my sister's response. Her voice had an edge of agreement. "I know, Matt. Sometimes it feels like I'm always responsible for her. If it weren't for my mom marrying her dad, I doubt we would even be friends." The weight of those words crashed over me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for air. The heat that sent me going for cold drinks was suddenly replaced by this eerie feeling that sent shivers down my spine and had goosebumps extending all over my skin. Each syllable struck a blow to my already fragile self-esteem. How did I become a burden, a hindrance to the very person I loved most? I was a pain to my sister. Matthew's words had struck an irritation within me, but Natalie's words sliced through my skin. And when I saw them kiss, the hurt was piercing. At that moment, I felt abandoned, discarded as an inconvenience in their lives. Just as I'd always known would happen, I was overwhelmed with questions, doubts, and a gnawing sense of inadequacy. As I made my way back to the pool, clutching the drinks in trembling hands, a heavy silence settled over us, and I wondered if they knew I overheard their conversation. The bond I had cherished so deeply became a cruel mirage, a figment of my somewhat naive imagination. The pain of realizing that Natalie agreed with Matthew's assessment cut deeper than any physical wound. I knew the problem. It wasn't me. Matthew was the problem, and he needed to go. I handed them their drinks, my hands trembling as I did, mirroring the tremors within my shattered heart. I forced myself to swallow the bitter taste of betrayal and smiled, pretending that everything was as it should be. I needed them to believe everything was fine. That would be my cover. They would have no reason to suspect me for what I had to do next. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled with a bundle of emotions. Anger, sadness, and a profound sense of loss consumed me. I watched from the sidelines, masking my confusion and heartache with a smile. I couldn't let them see the turmoil brewing within me, but in the corners of my mind, I began to see the misgivings in Matthew's character I'd been oblivious to. I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off about him. Then I decided to check in with my feelings. I began to follow him. I quietly gathered evidence of Matthew's questionable behavior and inconsistencies in the excuses he gave when he had to be away, late-night conversations with strangers, and secretive phone calls. It was as if the mask he wore in public was slowly slipping, revealing a different side of him to me. I began to understand why he hung out with us more, why it felt like he had no friends before we moved into town. It was all because he had a different life, a life Natalie would not be pleased with. I had him right where I needed him. I had everything I needed to get him out of our lives. I could get my Natty back. That Friday night, Natalie had just returned way after curfew from a party with Matt, one I wasn't invited to as expected. Since that day by the pool, they started seeing themselves, and I was cut off from hanging out with them as much as we did before. Not that it mattered to me, cause either way, it gave me ample time to check out who Matthew really was. I mustered the courage to have an honest conversation with her. I shared my concerns, gently exposing all of the things I'd found out. I wanted her to see it for herself. I needed her to make the connections of Matthew's dark side. Initially, my words were met with resistance. She defended him, every one of the misgivings, but I wasn't surprised. This is the way Natalie was. She saw the good in people and clung desperately to that version of goodness till she couldn't fight it any longer. But in her kindness, she's smart. She started questioning the discrepancies, the hidden truths that he'd skillfully concealed. By the end of the night, it was she who made the difficult decision to confront Matthew. The truth unraveled, revealing a side of him she hadn't anticipated. She was broken. It hurt to see her that way, but it had to be done. She ended things with him, and I couldn't be happier than I was from watching the little bond shatter like my heart did that day by the pool. But it didn't end there. The truth of his deceit spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of school authorities. It was discovered that he had violated school policies, leading to his expulsion just days before graduation. And as the whole scenario played out, he blamed me. I became the subject of his disdain. He blamed me for his downfall, seeing me as the catalyst behind his exposed secrets. His anger simmered, fueling a deep-seated resentment toward me, but I could care less. All I did was out of love to push him out of our lives for good. We didn't need him. There was a bitter taste in the air between Natalie and me after the whole scenario was exposed. I felt like a part of her blamed me for the hurt she felt. And in a way, she was right. But I didn't really care, as long as he was out of our lives. I'm not gonna lie, honestly OP does sound a little too unhealthy with their relationship with Natalie here. That said though, they did ultimately do a good thing for her in revealing that this person she was so infatuated with wasn't real at all. So like there's a bit of good and bad going on here, to be honest. I mean, I hope for OP's sake that they can rebuild a relationship with Natalie, because it still sounds like she's a bit on the fence. I think OP should still keep in mind the fact that Natalie was agreeing with Matthew's perspective of her. Like, even though OP got Matthew out of her life, there was a point where Natalie agreed OP was too overbearing. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.